Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today on the influences of the missionary call. It's great that you're here. I know we've been chatting with some of you in the chat box over there, and so your microphones will be muted just to preserve sound quality. But it's great to have the chat going, and so if you haven't, you can interact with us there. You can interact with each other as well. I know we've got people from all over the world on the webinar today. So if you haven't greeted everyone yet, feel free to go ahead and greet everyone. Let us know where you're from. I've got Tim and Sadie on the webinar. They're on staff here at the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention, and they're helping me out today in that chat panel. Just make sure if you want to greet everyone, that little blue box down at the bottom right hand of your chat box there, make sure that says all panelists and attendees if you want to interact with one another. Otherwise, it defaults to just panelists, and only the panelist here, which is me and Tim, will see those chats. So hope you make good use of that. We'll be taking questions at the end of our webinar today. And for that, we're going to use the question box. That is different from the chat. You see it at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. You can type in any question in there as we go throughout, and we will be answering those towards the end. We'll go about an hour today. So awesome, again, to have everybody here from all over the world. James from Michigan and Ivy from Madrid. So fun. Well, we just want to talk about some of these influences of the missionary call. And right away up front, I want to say that we believe it is God who calls missionaries. And so our purpose today is not to use these influences to try to manipulate people to go into missionary service. These are just simply what we think of as ways to study how God often speaks to people and how he guides them to become missionaries. And so that helps us in our mobilization efforts. So we also know that that these aren't the only influences. There's a lot more, and so you'll have opportunity to interact with us through some polls and everything, and in the chat box again on if you have thoughts or ideas. Again, if you have questions, they'll go into the question box down below the Q&A there. So let me share my screen here and bring up our presentation. And so we are going to be taking a poll right now. And this poll is, we want to know your role in missions. It's kind of fun to see who all is on the call today. And so if you see that poll just came up, your missions role, we'd like to hear from you. Maybe you're a pastor or a missionary, a mobilizer, a teacher, or a student. If you could go ahead and click there, and then pretty soon we can see those results. And so it's kind of fun to see who all is on our call today. We'll give you a few more seconds. Votes are still coming in. Okay, the poll is closed, and here are those results. So we've got a lot of mobilizers on today. That's awesome. And missionaries too. I love that. Just about everybody, a few pastors, some teachers and professors, and some students and others as well. So it's great to have you joining us today on this webinar. And so we are going to get right into things here. But first, we want to define what we mean by missions and missionary. And so I like this definition. There's lots of definitions out there, but I like this one from Michael Goheen in his book, Introducing Christian Mission Today. And he says this, that it's to establish a witness to the gospel in places or among peoples where there is none or where it is very weak. And so again, I know there's lots of maybe confusing definitions about what missions or what a missionary is, but basically for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to be using this definition. This often takes place in a cross-cultural context. So we believe not everyone is a missionary. We are all witnesses and we are all sent as believers, but not all are cross-cultural missionaries endeavoring to share the gospel in that way. And so for our call today, this is what we'll be using to define what a missionary or missions is. Okay, and then the other thing that I want to state just before we get into some of these influences is what we mean by call. And so how we define it, we agree with David Sills. It's a godly yearning that motivates and guides one to serve as a missionary. So we're talking about the missionary call today. Those are the terms and how we use them here. So just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. At first, we're going to mention some negative influences on the missionary call. We'll go through these fairly quickly, and then we'll get into some of those positive influences as well. So for these negative influences, obviously, this one might be obvious to many, but a lack of spiritual maturity is obviously a barrier or a negative influence on the missionary call. If people aren't praying, if they're not seeking God, then certainly they don't hear his voice. And so with this pandemic, however, we are finding that as the world is on lockdown, that people are praying more, and actually Bibles are flying off the shelves. We've heard some reports of that as well. Bible sales are going up. So that's a very good thing. But this lack of spiritual maturity can negatively impact the missionary call if there are those whom God is calling, but they're not in tune with him. They're not in his word. They're not in prayer. Pretty hard to hear his voice. So this is a really important factor and perhaps obvious to some. But also, I want to make mention that we in the West, at least, are very individualistic culture. And there can be an assumption in Western Christianity that Christianity is for me, that it's for my benefit, and when in fact Christianity is for everyone. It's for all. So maybe you've heard John 3:16, a pretty famous Bible passage here in the States. For God so loved the world, and sometimes people say, you can put your name in there. For God so loved Dave, or for God so loved Tim, right? And that is true. However, God so loved the world, and so in Western Christianity, sometimes if we think of it as a very individualistic thing, that inhibits the missionary call, and that has a lot to do with our spiritual maturity and understanding that Christianity is for all, and yet there are still vast parts of the world who have never heard of him for the first time at all. So next would be a lack of guidance. There are so many questions and maybe you think back to your call into missions, or if you are serving as a missionary, if you think about your call and the number of questions, there are just so many unknowns. And so for those that don't get their questions answered, it can be problematic, and that really inhibits the missionary call. So in conjunction with this is when churches don't promote missions, or when senior pastors really maybe don't have the missions vision for their church, that this can prohibit those whom God is calling to actually get to the field as well. So I know Bevan Ginder is on our webinar today. If you don't know Bevan, you need to go over to Global Cast Resources. Just Google that. Bevan is the founder and director of Global Cast Resources, and he trains missions advocates. He's got a lot of videos for training. It's just awesome. Bevan, great to have you here. I interviewed Bevan for a Missionary Mobilization podcast that's coming up in a couple weeks, so look for that. But this is what Bevan said. If it's all right, I quote you, Bevan. This is what he said about this lack of guidance. So one key obstacle, he says, people who say yes to Jesus' call to cross-cultural missions, is that they never go. One of the reasons is a lack of equipped and envisioned missions leaders, missions advocates, and missions mobilizers who will follow up and walk with them forward into their role. So Bevan says we need many more leaders with the heart of Barnabas who are able to coach, mentor, and champion the Sauls of this generation. So perhaps one missions mobilization obstacle is that the missions fruit on the tree that is not getting picked is because of a lack of mission mobilization harvesters. I think he said that really well. And, the missionary call oftentimes it develops over a number of years. Again, think back to your own call. If you are a missionary, if you have missionary friends, it's just something that develops over quite a period of time. And so those that don't have the guidance, many of them don't make it to the field. It was missiologist Dr. Ralph Winter who said, for every 100 decisions to become a missionary, only one of them ever gets to the field. And a large part of the reason for that is this lack of guidance component. So we'll talk more about this in a little bit. This is another big factor, fear, the fear factor, if you will. Uh, this prohibits people from getting to the field where God is calling them. And this could be fear for their own safety. It could be fear of fundraising, lots of different fears of the unknown. Again, the younger generations are fearful of the unknown and of their future. And so one of the ways we can help with that is by helping to guide them and to mentor them, of course. So a couple years ago, we surveyed our students here at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School in North Dakota, where we house the Center for Missionary Mobilization and Retention. And so we surveyed our students and we asked them lots of questions about their interaction with missionaries, about missions at their church. One of the last questions that we asked them on the survey was, what, in your opinion, prohibits believers from considering a call to missions? And we left it blank. In other words, we didn't give them any choices to select from. We just left a blank line so that students could write in what they wanted to. And did you know 33% of our student body wrote in the exact same thing? That thing was fear. So it's a big prohibitor in God calling people to missions and to be missionary. This is a really significant negative influence on the missionary call. Next, and I know we're going through these a little bit quick, but want to get to those positive ones here and dig into those a little bit deeper. But debt obviously is another thing that stops people from fulfilling what God is calling them to do, whether that's college debt or in other types of debt. This is an important thing. In fact, there's been organizations that have started. If you've heard of the Go Fund, they help pay off college debt to some missionaries who are going to the unreached. And so this is a important thing for us to consider about how do we minimize debt so that people can get to the field should God be calling them. And so this also can be related to fear or a lack of spiritual maturity as well. I remember when we were itinerating missionaries, we were back home in the States here, and we were traveling from church to church all throughout the week to support, raise our own funds, and to mobilize others. And so we were talking to one couple at our table after the service, which, by the way, is an incredible mobilization opportunities. We've had some significant conversations at our table. There in the lobby after the service, a lot of missionaries will put out things, and you can sign up for their newsletters. And so we were talking to one young couple, and they were sharing about their missionary call, and that God's called us to be missionaries. And so they said, but the problem is we have a lot of debt, and we can't do anything about that right now. And I said, well, have you applied to any organization? Have you looked into this? And they said, no, not yet, because of this debt. And I said, you're letting a little thing like debt stop you from fulfilling God's plan for your life? And that statement really impacted them. And so even though this is a significant factor that prohibits people from fulfilling God's missionary call in their life, we know that our God is bigger and that he provides for his people. And he provide where he guides, he provides. Have you heard that one? If it's God's will, it's his bill, right? And so we trust in a big God to take care of that debt. Yet there are perhaps some practical things that we can do to help people minimize that as well. Okay, next is family. This can be positive or negative, but sometimes if a spouse feels called to be a missionary and the other one doesn't, that can have a negative effect on them getting to the mission field. Oftentimes, a single person will feel called to the mission field. And so here's what we see sometimes: our graduates, they'll have some debt, and so they'll be paying that off after they graduate. And God's called them to the mission field, and so here they are getting ready to go, and then they meet someone and they fall in love, and that person maybe perhaps doesn't have the same kind of call that they do. They don't sense a call to the mission field, and those two get married and usually will never end up getting to the field because of that. So not only, though, is it a spouse that can have a negative effect, again, can have positive as well. But sometimes young people's parents can negatively affect them getting to the mission field, whether they feel pressure from mom and dad to live somewhere close, or they feel pressure to have a very successful career where they're making a lot of money. They feel that pressure from mom and dad. That can hinder them from getting to the mission field where God is calling them. This is especially true amongst Asian cultures and Hispanic communities as well, where family ties to their parents are oftentimes stronger than they are from in other cultures. And so these are some things to think about. So we want to know your thoughts on some of these negative influences. And so I'm going to put up another poll here for you to kind of take a vote on which of these negative influences that we talk about, that I've mentioned today, do you think is most prevalent? So you should see that on your screen right now. Please go ahead and vote your opinion of these negative influences. Which do you think is most prevalent or most important? Go ahead and think about it for a few seconds, and we'll leave that poll open. They're still coming in. So we've had 75% vote already, and it's still climbing. We'll give you a few more seconds here. What do you think is the most negative of these influences that has an impact? Okay, we're going to end the poll now. Most of you have voted, and here are those results. Sharing them now. So pretty even split down, but it looks like the winner, I don't know about the winner, but family seems to be what most people think is the most prevalent. So definitely that's a significant negative influence. And so perhaps there are some things that we can do as mobilizers and influencers in people's lives to help students, young people, or others whom God is calling, to help them navigate that in order for them to get to the mission field where God is calling them to be. So thank you so much for your input. And we're going to be moving in now to kind of the heart of this webinar, the positive influences on the missionary call. AGWM, Assembly of God World Missions, surveyed all their missionaries a few years ago, and they asked them, what is the one thing that most influenced your call to become a missionary? And hands down, prayer was the number one thing. And you can actually access this survey if you'd like. I believe Sadie's going to post a link to for you to access the survey if you're interested in looking at it some more. But Assembly of God World Missionary said that prayer was the number one factor. And so, obviously, this is probably no surprise to us that as we communicate with God and commune with Him and have fellowship with Him and sit and enjoy His presence and listen to His voice, that He speaks to us through prayer. And so, many young people will go off to camp. They'll go to youth convention, at least here in the States, that's really popular. They'll get out of their normal situation, and that they're more in tune with hearing God's voice speak to them. And so many young people feel first called to be a missionary at camp or at youth convention, somewhere out, again, it's out of their normal routine. So whether it be at a retreat or something along those lines. And as a side note, what's really interesting is that some of the research is showing that those people who are missionaries, they first felt called, the majority of missionaries first felt called to be a missionary between the ages of 14 and 19. And so that's a significant age group there that, if we think about it, that part of the reason for that is probably because that's the age where, students are thinking about, what am I going to do in the future? And they're open and they're wondering. And so they're beginning to seek God about what He has for them. So again, as we go along, if you've got questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A box, and we'll address those at the end of the webinar today. And we've also got something for you, an infographic that we're going to post a little bit here towards the end. So hope you can stay on the webinar. So how can we get people to pray? We want people to hear God's voice better, should He be calling them to the field. So there's some great prayer apps for your phone, whether it's Joshua Project's Unreached of the Day app. You can get that free. Operation World also has a prayer app that you can download to your phone. And so these might help people to engage better, praying for the nations. And there's also prayer initiatives like Juma prayer. As you know, Friday is the Muslim holy day. So it's kind of like our Sunday. But everything stops in the Muslim world on Fridays. And at noon, Muslims gather all over the world to pray, to hear a sermon, and to go to basically their version of church, right? And so there's a prayer initiative called Juma Prayer that that you could Google for interest in this. Fridays at noon, over 60,000 people stop and they fast and pray for Muslims all around the world. And so I personally know of missionaries who are on the field now because they were first involved in a Juma prayer meeting. There's another great new initiative called Change the Map. Change the Map. It's another prayer for the Buddhist world. And so there's lots of initiatives out there, resources that we can give to people, suggest to people to keep them inspired and to help them pray for the nations and to pray for more missionaries and unreached people groups around the world. So prayer is obviously the number one factor in our opinion, and seems to be in this Assembly of God World Mission Survey in what God uses to call people to the mission field. And so Bible study comes in at a close second. Those two are intimately related. So God often speaks to us through his word? How many times have you read a passage, and maybe it's a familiar passage that you've read many times over, but then this one day as you read that, it, God seems to speak to you in a different way about that passage. And in fact, that was the case for my wife, and how God called her into becoming a missionary. She was reading Romans 10, and again, she had read it many times, but this one particular day, she read the verse that how can they hear unless someone goes, and how can they go unless they are sent? And it was that verse that God used to, amongst other influences, but really used to speak to her about getting to the mission field, going to the mission field. And so, how do we begin to show people and teach people the grand narrative of Scripture, that that the thread of missions starts in Genesis 1:26 through 28, where God is commanding his people to scatter, to be fruitful. He's talking to Adam and Eve to be fruitful and to multiply and to fill the earth, to scatter, because God wants the earth filled with his people. And so how can we better educate people on the grand narrative of Scripture, and helping them to dig into maybe these not so popular missions verses throughout the Bible, to show them that there is a thread that weaves through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, and that thread is that all peoples come to know him. And so, as we study the Bible, God speaks to his children. That leads in very, very closely to missions education as another really strong influencer on the missionary call. Many of you are probably familiar with the Perspectives course or the Kairos course. These are courses that local churches can host, and members of the community can come and join these classes, and these are kind of like missions 101, if you will, an introduction to missions work. And education has a strong influence on the missionary call. And in fact, we have just started a Master of Arts in Intercultural Studies here at Trinity Bible College and Graduate School. And we've designed an optional track in missions mobilization. So if you're a mobilizer or a missions pastor and you really have an interest in getting more education in missions mobilization, maybe an MA degree, a higher degree, we hope that you can contact us and we can give you more details about that optional track in missions mobilization in conjunction with an MA in intercultural studies. A few months ago, one of our students invented a phrase in class as we were having a discussion, and the phrase that he invented was called intentional missionality. And so we kind of worked together to come up with a definition of this term. And here's what we came up with. Intentional missionality is the practice of keeping oneself interested, inspired, motivated, educated, and passionate in cross-cultural missions. So let's make that phrase go viral. I was talking to a prospective student who feels called to be a missionary to Africa. We were talking through FaceTime the other day, and I said, Noah, what do you do to keep yourself inspired and educated for missions? And he said, you know what? I don't do a whole lot. And I said, well, let me send you a book. And so, so this phrase, intentional missionality, how can we help guide people whom we feel God is calling and giving them those resources, whether it's a missions book, including missionary biographies. Those are great resources to hand out. Missions podcasts. There's all sorts of great missionary and missions podcasts out there that you can recommend to people that will educate them and keep them interested and passionate and help them to learn as again, the missionary call is most oftentimes a process. Now, there are some times when, it's a vision, it's a one-time thing where God calls somebody to become a missionary. But many times, as we survey young people and those called to be missionaries, we're finding that it's a process that happens over and over again. And there's so many of these influences that happen over a longer period of time. uh, I asked a young person, she's a senior in high school, her name's Abby, and I said, Abby, what do you do to keep your own self interested in missions? And she said, I love watching missions videos. And so she'll be on YouTube, she'll Google different videos and watch those. And so for the younger generation, that is perhaps one way that we can help to educate them is through more of these missions videos online to help the younger generation, encourage them in their missionary call. That leads us, of course, to having a mentor. This is a big one. And you know what? Young people today, especially, they want a mentor. If you study Gen Z, if you study the millennials, the young people today are asking for mentors, and that's maybe a little bit different than some of us who grew up who didn't want a mentor. So there's a wide open door here, and in fact, having a missionary mentor is an extremely significant influence. I've talked to many missions leaders around the country, and I hear them say one thing. Oftentimes, they say, missionaries are our best mobilizers. Is that true for you as well? You can put that in the chat box, but I've heard that over and over and over again. So here's the question: how can we position missionaries to become mobilizers while they're on the field or back in their passport country? And perhaps we need to do a better job as mission leaders to train them to be mobilizers as they are in congregations normally. If you're not on lockdown due to a pandemic, right? They're in churches every single Sunday. Many of them are raising funds. And so how can we train them to be mobilizers? There's a few resources out there. We've got some on our website, missionarymobilization.org, that you can check out, but we need a lot more resources for missionaries on how to be mobilizers and how to mentor others. They really have significant influence. In fact, referring back to this missionary call survey that Assembly of God Missions did, I mentioned that prayer was the number one influencer of our missionaries, of the missionaries' missionary call. Bible study was number two, but here's what was tied for number three on the most significant influences that influenced them to become a missionary. Tied for number three was having a conversation with a missionary or hearing a sermon preached by a missionary. So these relationships with missionaries specifically have such huge impact. And so again, that link is in the chat box. If you'd like to go and click on that, you can look at the survey online and study it for yourself. Again, as we go on here, we've got just one more positive influence to mention, and then we're going to go into a Q&A time. So if you've got questions, now's the time to enter those into the Q&A box, and we'll have a great discussion afterwards together. Short-term mission trips are another really significant influence. Obviously, we can't go right now during this pandemic, can we? Most of the country is on lockdown, and many summer mission trips have been canceled, unfortunately. But I want you to notice something. It is true that short-term mission trips can have a negative or a positive effect on the missionary call. And the negative is perhaps for some, it is simply something on their bucket list, something that they want to do in their lives, go on a short-term mission trip, and then they check it off, and then they don't consider long-term missionary service at all. some say that it can inoculate people to become long-term missionaries. So in other words, they get a taste of it, and then that's it. They don't want to have anything more to do with it. And we do recognize that as perhaps a negative influence. But some of the previous positive influences that we've already mentioned, prayer, Bible study, engagement with a missionary, having a mentor, those take place on a short-term mission trip. And again, it's out of their routine, right? When we can get people out of their routine, they seem to be open to hearing God's voice better. And so, what a great way to get them out of their routine, rubbing shoulders with a missionary, where they're praying more, they're reading their Bible each and every morning as they're there experiencing short term missions. And for some, they're rubbing shoulders with, say, an unreached people group. And so, they're seeing the lost and experiencing communication and conversations with those from the unreached, or those that are unsaved. And so short-term mission trips really have a significant influence on the missionary call. And again, in my opinion, and we do know, studies have shown that short-term mission trips do lead to long-term missionary service. Obviously, right now with this pandemic, many missions leaders are saying that that this COVID-19 pandemic will have a negative effect on long-term missionary service, because short-term mission trips are many of them have been canceled. Um, and I tend to think otherwise. I guess I'm more of an optimist and a visionary here. And so I tend to think that because some of their mission trips have been canceled, that will encourage them to go on one even more once the world kind of reopens. And we hope and pray that that is soon. As we know, many are suffering from the pandemic that's happening right now around the world. So I wrote an article called COVID-19 and the Future of Missions. That's on our website under Mobilization Resources. You can go there, and I list about 7 reasons why I think this pandemic will result in more missionaries going to the field. And we certainly pray to that end that God will take a terrible situation and he'll use it, redeem it, and use it for good to expand his kingdom around the world. And so, again, we want to take a little poll here and ask your opinion. Then we'll get into questions. As mission mobilizers, which positive influence do you feel we should prioritize? I know you probably want to check all those boxes. But out of these, or maybe it's another one that we haven't mentioned, you could click other. Out of these, what in your opinion, do you think we as mobilizers, mission pastors, students, what should we prioritize as we are helping to guide those God is calling to the mission field? We'll give you a few more seconds to think about that. We've still got about 77% of you have voted. And so that's still, some of you are still voting. We'll close it here in just a few seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. And here are the results. Look at that. It's having a missions mentor is the number one, but still pretty spread out between that and missions education. Prayer is a big one. All of these, I think, are important factors. And some of you wrote in other. We'd love to hear from you in the chat box about what you think those other influences are and what we can do to help people, encourage them in their missionary call. So thanks everyone for your interaction today. Before we get into questions, I'm going to ask Sadie to post a link. We've got an infographic that explains a little bit. It's kind of a picture with some text about the process of when God first calls someone to the field and getting them to the field. And so it includes some of these factors, both positive and negative, that we have talked about today. But we're going to get to your questions now. So again, that link is being posted in the chat box. You can click on that and download it for yourself. Anybody can use it. Feel free to share that wherever you'd like. So we're going to get into some questions, and let's see. Okay, we'll take one here from Jacob. He says, what ways have you seen that have been effective in mobilizing student missions outside of the normal commercial that missionaries could normally be given to speak to them? Um, you know what? In my experience here at Trinity, I work with students every single day and talk with them. Um, One of the best ways is to get to know them, to and to mentor them, and to be available to answer their questions, to be transparent. The younger generations, especially, they want to. They want to know some of the difficult parts. They don't want us to glass over those and to make missions seem more exciting than it is. Yes, it's awesome to be involved in missionary service, but there are some negatives as well. And as we live transparent lives and walk one on one with people, having these friendships with them, I think we're going to see an increase in missions mobilization. So thanks, Jacob, for that question. Doug asked this regarding missions education at the local church level. What curricula and or resources have you found to be most effective, accessible, and user-friendly for the average church member that is not already on fire for missions? You know what? That's a great question, Doug. Again, I'd recommend Perspectives. I would recommend the Kairos course. There's a course called Momentum Yes that is out there that's it's online based, I believe. So there's some great. Here's what I would do. I would involve your missionaries from the church that you support. If you're able to involve any time that we can bring a missionary in and have them relate to the members of our congregation, missions interest increases. And so if you have some close personal contacts with missionaries and you can bring them in to do a seminar and really build it up, you can feed them ethnic food or an ethnic dessert afterwards. So really make it a personal time, but also have a teaching time there. That can be a great idea as well. So really good question. Thanks, Doug, for that. Someone asks, outside of anecdotal experiences, what exegetical evidence is there that there is a such thing as a missionary call? I believe there is biblical support. Let's see, my question just kind of went away from me here. Not sure where it went. Here we go. I believe there is biblical support for a call to ministry, but not so much for a missionary call as a separate directive from God. Yeah, a great question. There's lots of articles and books written about this, the missionary call. And so, again, regardless of what you believe at the beginning, we just said that we believe it's simply a yearning or guidance from God to do missionary work. And so, however you interpret that, I also, for one, believe that people can volunteer to become a missionary. We've had students, and I know missionaries on the field already, some of them extremely successful, who simply said, God, I want to be a missionary. Can I do that? And of course, I don't think that would make God angry. Do you? So he, simply said, yes, you can do that. So I believe you can volunteer again, but it's a yearning inside. It's a desire, perhaps. Um, and so good questions. James writes, with many churches no longer having a Sunday night service or with small groups, how do you get to share with churches your call and ministry? We're losing a great opportunity for influence. Yeah, I know there's a lot of churches. Perhaps we can encourage churches to bring back Sunday night services again. But some of these home groups, cell groups, again, these one-on-ones with conversations. I was at a church service once, and I told about our ministry, and I preached a sermon, and afterwards I was back at the table. Again, table ministry is some of the most effective when we're engaging one-on-one with members of the congregation. And a 63-year-old lady came up to me at my table, and she was crying. And she said, I'm 63 years old. I'm going to retire in a couple years. She said, my husband passed away 2 years ago. And I thought that's why she was crying. But she went on to explain that here she is at 63 years old. And she said, I feel God calling me to become a missionary. And I don't want to waste my life anymore. And so we were able to have a discussion. Uh, so yeah, that's a difficult question. I know there are fewer opportunities, but your engagement with others on social media, um, again with the younger generation, especially, they're on Snapchat and they're on Twitter and they're on YouTube looking at videos. How we engage with them perhaps is in addition to church services. Maybe you can volunteer to host a prayer meeting at a church. We've done this before where we said we're going to have prayer for the nations. It's a special event. We're going to invite everybody. Ask the pastor, can we hold it on a Sunday night? Perhaps you can volunteer to teach a Sunday school class, or you can volunteer at the church potluck just to serve food. That's another way that you can interact. The more missionaries serve our churches and serve our pastors, the more opportunities we're going to have to get our missions message out there. So great question. Okay, let's see here. Regina asks, how would you guide someone who felt the call to missions early in life, but is now in a ministry that doesn't focus on mission, or has a pastor that seems to feel the urgency for missions or missions education? Uh, yeah, great question, Regina, and thank you for asking that you are there as a guide. Um, those one-on-one relationships with them, giving them those resources, talking to them about their story. And I know we have to be sensitive, but if you know the person, you can say, you can bring this up. Did you feel at one time God calling you to the mission field? And if so, is that still something in your future? Why or why not? Just really mentor them and have that friendship with them. Show them that you're going to love them regardless, and really be that disciple maker. Help to disciple them and to mentor them as well. Great question. Okay, let's see. Well, lots of questions. Wow. Let's see, we answered that one. For the current missionaries, what resources would help you mobilize better? What tools would you like to have available? Yeah, that maybe is a question for our missionaries who are on the call. So you can answer that question in the chat box if you'd like. And we'd love to hear your opinion about what resources you'd like to have to enable you to mobilize better. Okay, a couple more questions here, I think. There doesn't seem to be a lot of discussion about those called to dangerous residential areas or to places like a bar or etc. That can be anywhere in the world. How does one go about confirming that call while possibly facing criticism from pastors, congregation, etc.? Not quite sure what that person is referring to exactly, but it's important that regardless of the danger, I mean, the world, let's face it, is a dangerous place, and almost no matter where you are, there's some form of danger. And so, as we walk with people, as we mentor them, as we show them in our own lives that getting God's name and his fame to all the peoples and places in the world, that is most important. Despite the danger that comes, that's very inspirational. And for those whom God is calling to dangerous places, that can be a real encouragement to others. People are praying for those missionaries in dangerous places, so there's an increase in prayer in many cases. And so it's so important that regardless of the danger, that we continue in pursuing God's call for our lives. Okay, I think we've just got one more question, perhaps, from Ivy. She says, does Trinity Bible College and Graduate School offer tuition discounts for current missionaries? Are there distance ed courses available for current missionaries to continue education, either undergrad or at the graduate level? Yeah, not only Trinity, but there's also other schools, that can help in furthering your education. Trinity offers a 50% tuition discount for Assembly of God World Missionaries, I believe. And so you can find more information about that at trinitybiblecollege.edu. Okay, another question from Philip just came in. Thanks, Philip. How do I decide on a mentor where there's no one experienced in world mission? In my church and in the entire region, I can't find anybody. That can be difficult if there are missionaries that your church supports. You can reach out to them. I do know that you can go on to agwm.org and look at find a missionary there, and you can find somebody. You can contact them and ask them to be a remote missionary mentor for you. I also think that IMB has a missionary mentorship program, as I believe Crossworld does as well. So there are a lot of mission agencies, Philip, that would love to connect you with one of their missionaries in order to mentor you. And if we still can't find anyone, a second best option would be missionary biographies for you to read those. That can help speak into your life as well. So wonderful. Well, unless there is any more questions, hopefully the link posted. And I just want to leave you with these questions as we close today. And that is, if I can clear my screen here so I can read the questions. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. How can we best influence a believer's spiritual formation? We think about that. Think about that with your team, perhaps. How can we increase missions education, whether it's through the local church or online or using social media or an institute of higher education? What can be done to help people understand the grand narrative of Scripture? If you're a pastor, you have such an important role in missions mobilization as you preach through the whole Bible and show people the grand narrative that missions is from Genesis to Revelation. It's what this book is about. And how can we develop more missions mobilizers and mentors? Obviously, again, I want to shout out to Bevan Ginder and Global Cast Resources, who mentors missions mobilizers and missions advocates. Is a great resource there. But what else can we do to develop missions mobilizers and mentors? More books need to be written. More resources need to be produced. And finally, how can we utilize our own missionaries as mentors and mobilizers as they are back in their home country on furlough or itineration, or as they are in their country of service, where perhaps we can use a web-based option like we're doing today to communicate and to connect with people all around the world. So we want to thank you for tuning in to this webinar. And this is a way that you can get a hold of us. hello@missionarymobilization.org. Please connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, LinkedIn. And this webinar is being recorded, and we will post this to our website in the days coming ahead. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and for what you do. You've been prayed for. We are praying for you. We are for you. And if there's anything else that we can do to help, we do offer trainings. I'm doing a training with a missions agency here next week, and training their mobilizers who are not going to events and they're stuck at home. That's an option as well. So please look at our website. And if there's anything that we can do, this is a ministry of Trinity Bible College and Graduate School in partnership with Assemblies of God World Missions, a ministry that we offer for you. And so thanks so much for your engagement today and for your insights. We love and appreciate you, and we will be in touch. Take care.